Welcome to the first in a series of In Conversations With. Today I've got with me Jan Dubiel, who is the Director of Early Years Education for Harrow International. He's also responsible for their bilingual kindergarten programme. The idea behind this series is that these are thought pieces. We're going to be discussing early years education today. Jan is one of the leading experts in that area. So Jan, do you want to just give a bit more flavour to what you do?
So yeah, I've been involved in early years education now for over 30 years as a teacher predominantly, but also as an advisor, government advisor, writer, presenter, and the role I'm in at the moment, which is fascinating, is working with ASL Harrow schools, particularly around the notion of bilingualism and how we develop a very high quality, high performing early years provision that caters for the needs of children and parents who have very high aspirations, and how we shape those early experiences to be as effective and as meaningful as possible. So work I'm currently doing at the moment is I've just written a new curriculum for Harrow schools, which is a cross-piece, both international schools and kindergartens. And that's been a really interesting process in terms of articulating what is it we aspire for those children. What does a curriculum for early years really need to look like? A lot of discussion I had with people was around how we blend high quality, high level outcomes, academic outcomes, with what I might describe as a more holistic education, but things like learning behaviours, things like self-regulation and metacognition and so on. How do we build that into a curriculum, and then how does that shape around the view of a citizen? I think whatever education system you're in, the idea that you are creating and shaping the future citizens, future societies, is always a really, really strong element of it, and particularly in early years where those foundations are laid. What we do and how we introduce those concepts appropriately is always been a really interesting sort of arena of concern. So I've worked in the UK, so being based here in Hong Kong and working with a truly phenomenally international context is very, very interesting. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to this session.
Well, it's great to have you here, and we'll explore, I think, some of these ideas around curriculum and assessment and how we look at how early years education is developed a bit later in the conversation. But obviously, we're facing an interesting time for young people at the moment. I mean, I know certainly here at Kellett's, we've got when we're interviewing and doing our assessments of children coming into the school, we're seeing very different situation, in terms of their oracy and their level of commitment at the moment, in terms of their ability to play with other children. I mean, what impacts are you seeing in terms of COVID on these young people?
Well, it's interesting because I think we have two quite diverse experiences, if you like, because I'm still have connections with the UK, which has gone through a very particular process, and then I think here in Southeast Asia, and certainly in China and Hong Kong, it's been slightly different. So there's a bit of a lag in terms of what we're seeing. But certainly, I mean, one thing I think is that in years to come, this cohort of early children in the early years now is going to be a very interesting subject of study, because the children who are coming to early years now have grown up under COVID. Now, whatever that experience is, and it's varied across different countries, they will have grown up with social distancing, with people wearing masks, with sudden and unexpected lockdowns, all those things. And it'll be really interesting to see how that impacts on them as they go through the educational system, as they get into to later years. But certainly, I think the issues around socialisation and the issues around playing and working with other children, I think, is one that everybody has identified as something that is different and is atypical about this cohort. So I think things like lockdown and things like school closure and so on has given children a very different kind of experience, and I think part of that is it's very much shaped their interaction with other children. They're not used to being with large groups of children.
No, I think one of the interesting things is that we've found, even when they're in school, is usually in the early years we're trying to get children to play and to cooperate and to share things, and we play nicely in the sandpit, and then we end up saying, well, actually you can't share stuff, you've got to have your own stuff, because you might contaminate the child next to you and so on. So how are schools going to, how can we respond in schools now that things are beginning to open up? What should our priorities be?
Well, I think actually, you've used the word priorities, and I think in any educational situation you prioritise what those children most need. And I think coming out of COVID and coming into this situation, maybe we need to realign that slightly differently. So, for instance, I think children's well-being and children's emotional and psychological health, although that's always been important, I think what the experience of COVID and lockdown done is make that even more acute. So I think we should be even more attuned than ever to supporting children's well-being, and enabling children to talk about and represent some of the experiences they would have had. One of the things on some of the work I did in the UK is, as I was, just before I started this role, we were just coming out of COVID at the time, and reception classes were starting. And I did a lot of work with schools at the time talking about the opportunity to represent ideas and to use things like Small World and to use kind of art materials and so on to represent feelings and experiences that they will have had, and to be able to talk about and articulate them. Because one of the things we know about very young children is they don't always have the language that meets the experience. So actually scaffolding that and encouraging that and enabling that, I think, is a key part of what we're doing. Also, and you touched on this, which is really important, the issue around socialisation, social interaction and cooperation and negotiation. These are critical life skills that start in early years, and they've been very, as you said, they've been very blurred by what's happening. And the third thing I would say is and it's a small, not small thing, but it's the issue of masks. What I've noticed really interestingly is when you're masked, and I've been in school obviously with a mask, I find it very difficult to read other people. You're cutting off a huge area of facial expression. What's been interesting, that some of the feedback we're getting from teachers is children are tuning in to actually being able to read from just the notes. So they, as usual, they adapt to the reality, and that's one of the things I think we're really interesting. When the masks do come off permanently, it's very interesting to see what those children will do. Will they be freaked out by seeing a whole face, and then have to completely realign their understanding of the world? Because those children who are 4 or 5 now, their whole understanding of the world has been shaped by the last few years. Yeah. So anything outside the home is certainly in Southeast Asia is we're looking at the eyes upwards. So I don't think we really know what the impact of that is. What I would say as educators is we need to be aware of it and tuned into it, and be ready to shape things and adapt things around that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm particularly interested in this mask problem and trying to teach phonics, because so much of learning to the sounds and so on, how to make sounds and how to identify them and so on. They're missing out on so much of that, and we're finding it with older children in terms of learning languages. Again, it's very different. We look at people's lips, and we literally lip read people when we're learning language. And so how are schools going to develop those sorts of things?
Well, it's interesting again, and I think I suppose the research question here is what's happening to children. Are they adapting to actually tune into nuances are they heightening their other senses to compensate for it, which we know happens, or is this going to form a barrier to actually? I mean, you're right. Phonics is a really good example, because that's all about very, very nuanced sounds, which you look at in terms of facial expression. So again, it'd be really interesting, because I suppose that cohort are now in that sort of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 area of phonics. So actually seeing how that works and that happens is going to be really interesting. I mean, one of the kind of flip sides of this is certainly in the UK, when children came out of lockdown, one of the things I noticed for some children, by no means all children, but some children's language ability was actually better than typical, because they'd been in environments where they'd had lots of high quality conversations. They'd often talked to peers, but siblings who were older. They had lots of quality time with parents, had a lot of serve and return opportunities. And actually their language and their vocabulary and their kind of nuances of language, their protocols of language were actually more heightened. Yeah. And that's not for all children, it's highly dependent on experience.
I mean, we're finding that. I mean, you've got such a range of parenting going on in places like Hong Kong and China and Southeast Asia, where you've got, sometimes you've got both parents are professionals, they're not at home, the child's being looked after by a maid who's operating in a second language. All of these challenges, they're not mixing with peers. Some people have been very, very risk averse in Southeast Asia in terms of mixing. So the whole range of experience. So if you've got a parent at home who's giving you a lot of attention, you can see great verbal development and cognitive development, whereas with some of the other children who haven't mixed with peers, haven't got older siblings perhaps, and so on. And of course this is compounded in China, where of course there's still we've got a lot of children who are only child, because of the one child policy sort of not working, still sort of having its impact. So there's a lot of challenges, particularly in Southeast Asia, that we're not going to see in other parts of the world, I suspect.
No, absolutely, and I think the issue of that intensity of relationship, which is interesting anyway, even pre-COVID. Yeah. That and actually part of the motivation, I think, for kindergarten education in China particularly was to enable children to socialise, to enable to have contact with other children. And that was, in the Ministry of Education guidelines, that the idea of social interaction is a really strong element of it. So it was always going to be an issue anyway. You're right, that's been absolutely intensified by what's happened. And I think, again, being aware of that and prioritising that as an area for development and for explicit teaching and opportunity has to be at the forefront of any curriculum, that any recovery curriculum that then enables children to have a more typical type of experience. But it is an issue, and as I said at the beginning of this, I think we may be a while off from seeing the actual impact of the impact it's had on children, because that may take time to kind of filter through.
Yeah, and we're finding there are cultural differences between expats families who have been, who have had a different attitude, for example, in Hong Kong to vaccination. So they're heavily vaccinated. There's a sort of bit, within the expat community, there's sort of a bit more sort of community immunity, as it were. So their children are all playing with each other. They've used the time during the lockdowns and when we're not, or not the periods of homeschooling. To actually play. They've been playing with other children, whereas some of our local families have been very locked down, they've been at home, they've been very isolated, and this has obviously led to very different attitudes to socialisation and also to language development.
And I think the other element I think we need to be cognizant of here is obviously technology. And that a lot of that communication then happens through screens, through Zoom or through other digital platforms available, but through that type of interaction. And again, while it replicates normal human interaction, it's not. It's digital interaction. Yeah. And I think again we will need to take account of a generation, a cohort of children who are growing up where the digital communication at certain points was the only means of communication they had with their peers, with teachers, with anyone else outside their very close immediate family. And again, I think the impact of that, and I think there are two sides to everything, and I think there could be positives in that. I think they will be, and children always are, much more comfortable with technology than perhaps older people. But also, I think again it skews that nature of human interaction, and anyone who knows that, anyone who's worked on, we've all worked on those digital platforms, the difference between that and having the conversation here, a face-to-face conversation, is very, very different. Even though it's ostensibly the same, and there are kind of sort of hidden things, that, other elements of it which we're only aware of subconsciously, which are big factors. And I think again, I wonder whether children are missing out on that so completely. so that their default communication becomes a digital one. And I
Sounds
think
like teenagers.
Well, yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I think that could be. That could
some
be
proto-teenagers in our
absolutely.
In the making.
And again, I think that the difference with early years children is older children have a residual memory and experience, a reference point of pre-COVID. So they had done the face-to-face things, they had done the non-digital reality, and like you said, they come to teenagers, they find that anyway. Whereas these children won't. This is their absolute reality. This is what they're used to. This is their truth. And I think we are all assuming. I think this is different. This is a blip in civilization. But we're going to have children who carry elements of that, throughout their lives, and this point on. And I think it will be interesting to see what the consequences of that are.
So if we were having a conversation with parents today, I mean, what advice would you give parents of early years children? How can they sort of fill the gaps and try and sort of approach this and help this progress?
Well, I think the things we've touched on, one is around socialisation and mixing with different people, mixing with people without masks if possible, and trying to give them an alternate reality of what that's like. And I think we're on the way out of COVID here, but so hopefully that will loosen up. The other thing, and I think it's an issue, always been an issue anyway, but it's about that emotional literacy and the psychological well-being of children, and being really cognizant of that. And giving children scaffolding and giving children the language to articulate it and talk about it. If you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the kind of emotional welfare is quite high up on that. I think if we want children to be effective learners, we want them to be successful in the broadest context of what that means, then that's all based on a secure sense of self. And I think it's fair to say that's been rattled quite significantly over the past couple of years, and they've grown up in that context. So being able to understand it and being able to articulate feelings or articulate anxieties, articulate concerns, because also they're picking up on the media and conversations and all those anxieties which are flying around, which are kind of a multitude of those. So giving and it comes back to, I think, the primacy of language development in early years. As the EYFS in England was recently reviewed, and one of the things it did significantly is it put language and communication as the first area of learning, because everything relates around language, everything about learning and development and sense of self and sense of confidence relates around how articulate you are, how you can connect thoughts together, how we access memory through language, and so on. So scaffolding that language, not just in terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of protocols. We talk about serve and return, and we talk about the protocols of different language in different situations. Those are all very explicit and implicit things that I think parents can do, which will strengthen their children, both as learners, but also as people. And it's also it's giving them time to give them normal types of experiences. Preparing food, you're putting the washing on the line, running through leaves, or counting birds in the sky. These are all very simple, kind of everyday activities in which, under the surface of which, there is a huge amount of learning and development which is subconsciously taking place. And often when I work with parents, one of the things I say is, when you strip away kind of some of the stuff you think about, or you think you know about, or stuff you've read, parenting is very instinctive. Ultimately, it's a very instinctive thing. It's a thing not all adults, but adults do from an instinctive basis, and we have to start with that, and then layer on what we know about neuroscience, what we know about socialisation, and so on top of that. So it's actually kind of perhaps stripping that out, not overthinking it, and stripping it back to very simple activities and talking about them with children. And through that, you will hit all the things that I think that parents are concerned about.
I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is that I think there's been a journey from when I was a child about how parents manage risk. I mean, I look back to sort of the experiences I had as a young child, where I sort of as a sort of 7-8-year-old, my parents would quite happily, give me a packed lunch, tell me to come back at tea time, and I'd go on a 6-mile bike ride or something, which is a world that away from, particularly here in Southeast Asia, where that sort of thing isn't very, very possible. But what worries me around COVID is we've gone to the next level of risk management, you know, insofar as, you know, here we are, we've got masks, we've got isolation, you know, it's very much a risk-averse culture at the moment, and COVID has sort of absolutely sort of put that to the power of 10, and that worries me in terms of children learning to manage risk and how they manage danger. And, you know, we see this, you know, with children learning to cross the road, you know, on their own. I mean, they've got to learn to cross the road at some point, you know, but I mean, they haven't been out of their flats. They, you know, they've been delivered everywhere, you know, whether it's by bus or by parents to dropping off at school. And the whole way in which the culture has been damaged, if you like, around this is something that I think as parents and educators we really need to be aware. So I'm interested in how we manage that, you know, to get young people, young children to develop a sort of a sensible attitude to managing risk going forward.
I mean, I think that was a trend that's been happening anyway over the past kind of 20, 30 years. And you're right, I think, you know, when we grew up, the idea of what was permissible or what was expected was very, very different, and that notion of risk was certainly differently perceived by parents at the time. And you're right, though, COVID has kind of exacerbated that in a very particular way, particularly around kind of contact with people. So I think again, it's I don't think the issue around risk is massively new because of COVID, but it has been intensified. And again, it's having you know, without being too technical, it's having a sensible approach to risk management, and it's asking the question, well, what's the worst that can happen? You know, so it's like if a child is in a playground, what's the worst that can happen? They might fall over and they might graze their knee, they might fall down and, you know, hurt their leg, and it's going to be broken, and that's not serious. And actually, when I do training around outdoor provision particularly, and risk taking, you know, how we understand, children understand their own physical limitation by crossing them and hurting themselves. You know, as long as that isn't a serious injury, that's how they find the limits of it. You know, I think of my childhood, everyone I knew had grazed knees and bruised elbows, because that's how he found out. And I think, again, that's a mindset about managing the impact of risk. And it's not saying that children should never experience anything which they find challenging. I think that's quite serious if they don't. They become very cosseted, and that's true physically as well as it is, you know, intellectually and cognitively. So it's again, I think it's working with an existing mindset of saying how do we manage effective risk for children, and also being clear to parents that taking risk is a fundamental part of life, but it's also particularly a fundamental part of learning. We learn most effectively when we go outside of our comfort zone, and we take cognitive risk. So there is a mindset around risk which is a really interesting one, and I think that's you know, it's really important that parents are aware of that.
So Jan, I really want to move away from COVID and to sort of see if we can.
I think we all do.
See if we can move on and start talking about sort of the developments of what's going on in early years thinking at the moment in terms of curriculum. And I know you've got some particular ideas around assessment for young children.
Yeah, I think, well, as I said in the introduction, we've just produced a curriculum for our schools and bilingual kindergartens. And the issue of curriculum has been a really interesting one over the past kind of 3 or 4 years or so. So, for instance, in the revised EYFS in England, the concept of curriculum is very central to that. And I think that's led to a very interesting debate about what we mean by curriculum in early years, which I think was, you know, always part of the lexicon, but I'm not always convinced we had a clear enough definition of what we meant by it. And often the concept of curriculum was conflated with pedagogy and conflated with assessment.
Well, I think you're going to have to give us your definition of curriculum then.
Okay, well, very simply, curriculum is the stuff we want children to learn. What is it we want children to learn? And we take that decision as a society, actually, but certainly as educators. We're saying, to be successful, children need to know this, or be able to do this, or understand this. And children don't know what they don't know, so part of our role as educators in a very sort of clinical way is to deliver a curriculum that will enable and empower those children. So I think one of the critical distinctions we need to make is between curriculum and pedagogy. So curriculum is the stuff we want children to learn. And I genuinely believe curriculums should be quite boring. They're quite dry. They're about the very dull statements or the dull aspiration, written dully in terms of what we want for children. And pedagogy is what makes that come alive. So pedagogy is the process by which children access the curriculum.
Okay, I'm going to come in
and
here.
That's where the fun happens.
Yeah, I can see that. But so when we talk about curriculum, are we talking about content, as in sort of facts and figures and stuff that children should know at that age, or are we talking about skills and what they can do?
Well, that's a really very, very insightful question, because a curriculum in early years needs to cover all elements of what they need to know. Now, if we take that phrase, what they need to know, yes, some of that is very sort of discrete information, like talk about phonics, or identifying numbers and knowing the sixness of six, or knowing the process of how we describe melting and so on in science. So there's that kind of what we would call academic knowledge, which is obviously has an important role. But alongside that, 99% of what you do as a human is learned behaviour. Apart from very, very basic functions, everything else is learned. So when we talk about something like metacognition, or we talk about something like self-regulation, or we talk about something like emotional literacy, those are learned behaviours. If they're learned behaviours, that means they're taught, therefore they need to be part of the curriculum. So as part of the curriculum that we've produced, there are domains of learning, which maths, literacy, language and so on, but we also key to it is what we've called disciplines. And those disciplines are the kind of soft skills, the learning behaviours, if you like, which underpin the approach and the type of learner and the context of learning that happens. Things like creativity, things like cognition, things like self-regulation, as I've mentioned already. So I would say they are very much an integral part of the curriculum, and actually a curriculum, certainly for early years, won't be complete unless you are teaching and enabling children to learn those elements as well. And there's no dichotomy, they don't conflict with each other, because they in good practice they weave together as part of that everyday experience you have. So for instance, you wouldn't have a session on self-regulation and say this is how we do it, but you would weave it into conversations, you would weave it into stories and situations where children needed that to be co-regulated and supported and scaffolded. That you would do that in the same way you would interact to address a misconception about number, or to support a child's use of phonics. In the same way you would support their self-regulation. So that notion of curriculum, that stuff, what we need to know, and actually it's really important that we unpick that to make sure it covers all elements of that learning and development.
Yeah, and this is sort of one of the challenges I think we find in schools when working with parents, because parents tend to focus on the sort of content, the facts, the figures. Does my child know know their colours, know their numbers? Can they write? Can they form the right letters in the right way, and so on? Whereas actually so much of what we're teaching in schools in the early years is these negotiation skills. It's the socialisation stuff that we were touching on earlier.
Yeah.
It's these important building blocks for life that they go through, and also this ability to learn. And I know when some parents walk round and you've got this traditional model of children sitting down and all the rest of it, and you go into a modern early years classroom, then they're all moving around, they're doing all sorts of stuff. They might be role playing in a corner and so on, and this isn't understood as learning. This is seen as sort of just a play activity, and actually what they're learning there is a really important skill.
Absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right. Certainly, I think in the time I've been in early years, that movement, that shift towards a greater understanding of exactly how children become learners and what's important, and particularly, I think if you've described it, it's the interplay, the synthesis between what is directly taught and through an adult or with another peer or in a context, and then how a child explores and makes sense of that. So the example often used is you teach a concept of number and the fives and your one-to-one correspondence and so on, and you teach that in quite a direct way, because it's not a negotiation. There is a way of there's a reality or truth about mathematics, for example. But then when a child goes off and they count the number of plates to match each teddy bear for a teddy bear's picnic, or they count the number of shells they put in a pattern in the sand, they are making sense and internalising the purpose of learning number.
Yeah.
And I think this is where the distinction lies. And I think this is the importance of early years, is that they need concrete, real experiences to make sense of what they've learned. And actually, we know from neuroscience, if they don't do that, the connection is weak and it gets pruned very quickly.
Yeah.
So this interplay and this symbiosis between what is directly taught and what the child takes from that and uses in their own we call it their own episodes of activity or their own episodes of learning, is a really, really important one. And you're absolutely right. To the untrained eye, often very high quality early years settings look chaotic, they look noisy, they look unstructured. Actually, when you pick beneath the surface, what's happening is highly structured, is highly thoughtful, displays huge amounts of knowledge for them to do
applied
that.
knowledge.
Absolutely. And I think there's more of a consensus than there was, I think, about that. But I think that's still something that is part of how we explore that and explain that to parents. That they're not just going off and playing in a sort of meaningless way. They're actually utilising their knowledge. One of the things and this is part of the direction I want to take our early years in Harrow, is we need to be really serious about early learning. And I think partly that's how it's perceived by other people, but I also think as an early years community, we don't always represent and articulate the seriousness of what we do. So while it might look fun and it might look exuberant and it might sound excitable and so on, the quality of what's happening is actually very, very serious and very important. We know birth to 7, critical period of neurological growth. What happens there is lays the brain architecture for life. 70-80% of your lifetime neurological connections happen in those first 7 years. So what we're doing, every interaction we have, every question, every decision we take with very young children has a massive impact on them, brain-wise. So, and I think we need to, as a community, as an early years community, which I consider myself part of, we need to be a lot more serious about how we articulate that, because I'm not always convinced we come across as the serious element of education that we provide.
So I'm interested then. So let's say you and I, we work in Asia. There's renowned for our tiger parenting approach and very formalised structures. So I mean, just to answer that question then, when do you start? When should children start ended up with slightly more formal stuff, sitting in at a desk, for example, rather than moving around or having formal phonics? I mean, what age do we start?
How do we shape that? So, I mean, that is a $24,000 question, isn't it? At what point do you introduce that? First thing I would say is that a lot of teaching that goes on, even with very young children, is what I would describe in inverted commas as formal. If you are giving a child a fact or giving information, or even you're reading a story, you could argue that is a formalised view of education or a formalised view of teaching and learning. So I think it's misinterpreting to say that doesn't happen in early years, because I think it does. It happens in a much more subtle way, in a much more kind of a responsive way. But there is always formal teaching. Even with a baby, you are teaching things in a formal way. So I think it's a question of how you build upon that and the progression of how that balance, how that relationship works as children get older. And obviously, as they do get older, they are more able to take on more direct teaching and a more, if you want to use the word, which is fair enough, a formalised kind of learning. I think the issue always is that we need to trust educators to be able to judge and respond to what's appropriate for individuals and groups of children, because development, and that's what this is. This links into neurological development is a very wide bell curve in terms of what's typical. So I think one of the things that I always try and talk about is that notion of professional judgment and having a pedagogical repertoire, which means that when you approach different children or you're working with different children, you tailor your responses and your expectations and your delivery to the needs of that individual child. In a reception class, you can have children who are writing, for example, in sentences with full stops, and you can also have children who are still, mark making in a non-phonologically aware way. So you're always dealing with this big sort of phase of what's typical, and it's about being responsive to that.
I mean, you and I know that you get your tiger parent who comes in and says, my child must be the one who's writing in full sentences with full stops, and why are they there? So I mean, how do we as educators approach that sort of phenomenon of tiger parenting, and how do we how can we sort of win them round to your view of how we educate?
That's not my view.
Well, the wider view.
Yeah. No, I think the work I've done with parents and nature, I always start with the science. I always start with the evidence of what we know. What do we know about children's brain development and wider development, and how does that fit with an approach to teaching? Is it effective to teach very young children who aren't phonics when they're not ready for it? And I know that's a phrase which has been massively misused for all the wrong reasons. But I think we start with the science of learning and how certainly in the early years, and it's called the foundation stage in England, we're building the neurological architecture on which that perhaps more formal, discrete, those bodies of knowledge are going to build. If that's not secure, those bodies of knowledge have nothing to connect to. So all the things that we do, all the conversations we have, all the opportunities, experiences that we give children, all the opportunities to cooperate, negotiate, all the things that we've talked about, they are vital in establishing a firm architecture. And I think when you explain that to parents and you look at the work of neuroscientists and how they've kind of explored the role of early childhood in terms of learning, then I think they're a lot more confident and reassured about this balance of approach. But it's also important to say we shouldn't not teach children phonics if they're at that point of development. I think part of that professional judgment is to say, if these children are ready to move forward, then of course we challenge them. We keep taking, as I said, we keep taking them out of their comfort zone. And where they're ready for that, and that is a spread out bell curve, but there are children at that end who at younger ages are ready, and we shouldn't be afraid to give them those experiences to take that learning forward, because if we don't, we're actually building in this level of frustration for them because they know they can do it. When I worked in the UK, I worked with reception children who were desperate to learn to read and could already decode.
Yeah.
Now, although they were working way ahead of what might be expected at that level, of course you support that, of course you continue taking that forward. One of the things the brain does is that if you're not continually challenged, if you're not continually having to move out of your comfort zone, you become scared, and we're back to risk taking, you become scared of doing it.
Yeah.
And there is a phenomena of children who, for whatever reason, find things very easy going through primary school. They don't have to try, they're not challenged. Then at some point, often in secondary school, they hit a wall, and they don't know how to learn.
No.
They don't know how to deal with something they can't do. Yeah. Whereas other children who followed a more typical trajectory have built up skills and built up a well of approaches to that. So we should be, and particularly for more what we might describe as more able children, we should be particularly conscious that they are challenged, because actually it will damage them if they're not.
Oh, that's really good. And it's not just neurological development as well, it's sometimes physical development. I mean, we get parents trying to get, children to why is my child not writing? Well, their fine motor skills in their hands, their physical development isn't at a point where they're going to have those sufficient fine motor skills to be able to do that.
I think where we replicate the British system, we are in an interesting place, because and I see this very directly because we have international schools which follow the British system, and we have bilingual kindergartens which follow the Chinese kindergarten model. And there's a very interesting issue around the age band after reception. So it's kindergarten 3 in China and year 1 in the UK, and the UK-based system. And actually, it's worth saying that the rest of the world operates a kindergarten system which goes up to the end of year 1 to children at 6 or 7. And actually, the England or the UK doesn't. We start school at 5, and particularly year 1 comes under the national curriculum. And that is a really interesting anomaly, because actually we sit out of as I said, the rest of the world, who, for children of that age, they will still have a broadly kindergarten type experience, whereas in the UK we put them into the national curriculum, and however appropriate the pedagogy is around it, because that's the same as content, it becomes slightly different. And that is a very interesting discussion.
And that's challenging for us in international schools, where we've got people from different international backgrounds. I know when we were speaking before we started recording this, you were talking about a school in Taiwan. I think we've got to get that.
Yeah, the school I worked with, they because of the local the economy, they had probably what are the most two diametric extremes of the spectrum in terms of parenting. So on one hand, they had a lot of Danish parents, but I can't remember, possibly Lego, but they had a lot of Danish parents on one hand. And so the Scandinavian model is very open-ended. Forest schools, it's a very much working with the child. It's a very holistic view of education. They don't teach formal literacy until children are 6 or 7. It's a very kind of open-ended kind of view of education. But also, because I can't remember which company it was, they had a lot of South Korean parents as well. So their view of education was much more kind of direct, and much less around the whole child, and more around the development in particular academic areas. And so they saw early years as the forerunner to that. Now, what was interesting when those parents got together, they would be diametrically opposed views of the quality of what happens. And obviously the Danish parents would be saying, this is far too formal, we don't want children. The South Korean parents were saying, this isn't anywhere near formal enough. Yeah. And actually, I mean, it was an interesting experiment. So I remember talking to the early years lead and the head teacher, and finding a way where both sets of parents were happy with what happens is almost the blueprint for a perfect view of education. Because if you can equate both those extremes, and they are both extreme views, if you can equate them in the middle somewhere, some sort of synthesis, you have a model which does work. And I think that's where they were getting to. And a lot of it was exploring, as I said, exploring what we know about neuroscience, what we know about development, about physical development, what we know about what's appropriate for each child. But also, we kind of come full circle back to curriculum. It was about saying, what do you want for your child? And everyone, and that's one thing the parents all agreed on. So they all said, yes, of course we want them to be literate, of course we want them to be numerate, of course we want them to have core knowledge, we all call those sorts of skills, of course we want that. But both parents also said, we want them to be good citizens, we want them to be happy, we want them to be able to have relationships with people, we want them to be able to manage their emotions, we want them to be able to think creatively. So you had this starting point which actually fused things together, and actually what it becomes around isn't the curriculum and what we want for children, it's how you get there. And I would argue that's where it becomes the preserve of the professionals, of educators, to say this is how we manage those aspirations for you and your children, because that's what we're trained and qualified and skilled to do.
Yeah, and that's a fantastic note on which to end the whole thing. What a vision! Somewhere, sort of the cross fertilisation of Danish and South Korean education, I think, is probably what we're all working towards. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to sit here and have a conversation with you about the early years. Thanks very much.